This is Cosmographia, the Randall Carlson podcast. And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Kosmographia podcast with Randall Carlson. And we are joined, as always, this week by Bradley. How you doing, Brad? See, you got the medal behind you there.
I'm good. Yeah, I love that ruthenium image. So that's my background. Subject to change, though. See what Randall comes up with. But yeah, I'm real good. How about you guys?
No, we're doing great.
Yeah, doing good, man.
Yep, working hard. Our jobs have not been affected by all this crap going on, so everything's normal for us.
Getting
Mike?
hot in Texas, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Speaking of normal.
Yeah, Mike. Everything normal over there, normal guy?
Everything is fine here at the normal household. As opposed to Bradley's nice ruthenium background, I have my wall and windows with shutters.
I gave you a nice map to put on that wall there, Mike.
I don't think he doesn't look like he wants a map.
Yeah, we got to do something to sexy up Mike. I'm not sure what it is. But,
That red shirt's not enough, huh?
That red shirt's pretty sexy, I think. Randall, how are you doing this week, sir?
doing well. What can I say? Fantastic. Although I was doing so fantastic yesterday that I started working out, and today my old injury at my fifth lumbar in the bottom is brief. So it's like,
Well, we have something to say about the last show.
yes, I think the boys have to come clean about something here.
So Kyle and I are paying attention to a lot of stuff in here while the show is going on. And Randall,
Don't make excuses.
because I remember, I'm reviewing the show from last week before this show, so I can remember what was going on, and listening to it as a podcast, as opposed to being in here with all the stuff going on, I have a greater comprehension level. And when we get up to the part where he asks us to look up Palace, as listening to it as a podcast, I knew what he was talking about. And when we were in here doing it, we didn't know what he was talking about. And so what we looked up was Palace, P-A-L-A-C-E, the building. And so we're like, what the Palace in Greek mythology? And of course we're getting Olympus, and we're trying, and then I'm like, maybe we should check etymology, and we're following the etymology down to Palladium and Palatium and everything. And what he actually meant was Pallas the Titan, or the giant, in mythology.
Mm-hmm.
Pallas the giant, right, is probably what you were talking about. Pallas the giant, who was born of Uranus and Gaia from the blood of Uranus falling to the earth.
Yes.
Okay, that's what you were looking for. So that's why we dove down this enormous rabbit hole going, what is he telling us to find with Pallas?
Hey, I think we did a pretty good job looking up the complete wrong thing. I mean, come on.
Yeah, I'll give you
We
credit
did
for
come up
that.
with some interesting esoteric stuff with that.
Yeah, the wood that descends from the heavens was definitely an interesting aspect of that whole rabbit hole.
Yes.
Even though we didn't follow the right word.
But you played it off pretty well.
Yeah, you were like, well,
I knew you would find something.
yeah, there would be something weird in there.
Yeah, well, it's not what I was expecting, but it's something. Yeah. Well, I'm sure you guys will do much better in the future.
Right, we'll try.
Ask for a spelling.
It'll never happen again.
Yeah, it's okay. I'm relieved. Yes.
Be glad you didn't go with phallus.
Right.
Why is he having us look this up?
But yeah, I do think it's interesting, based on what you were talking about with all the platinum group metals and the effect they may have on the biology of Earth, the research that was done with the DNA when they were, and so this story of the god Uranus being castrated, and then the blood of Uranus falling to Earth, Gaia, and that birthing the giants, one of which was Pallas, It's a very interesting story when you're thinking about comets and injection of biology and evolutionary changes into the biosphere. So
Yeah. And I'm not sure what it means, but I mean, what happened, as far as like doping the ruthenium atom, turning the DNA molecule into a piece of molecular wire with 10 times the charge capacity. I don't know what that means. Not yet anyway, but I'm very curious about that. And I think it could be perhaps one of those kinds of hints that leads you into something pretty extraordinary.
Yeah, I tried looking that up and kind of doing some research, but everything that I found, the names of the papers I couldn't even understand. I was just like, what is this? I couldn't even get close. So I passed it off to a couple of friends that might have a better chance of comprehending what I was seeing there. Something it has to do, I think, with chemoluminescence. Like chemistry. Chem, which I had never heard of before, but I don't know.
Okay. Well, so we talked about the platinum group metals, PGMs, that are delivered to Earth via cosmic objects. We did talk about comets, the life cycle of comets, and the 5 stages in the life cycle of a comet, and how the last and final stage is its disintegration into multiple subnuclei, if you want to call them that, and dust, a lot of dust, and how that could possibly affect the Earth, but also affect the whole solar system in its own way. We haven't yet talked too much about the infall of sun-grazing comets, and we'll definitely be coming back and addressing that when we get to the talking about the sun, which we're going to do. We'll do a series on the sun, coronal mass ejections and proton events and solar storms and its effect on Earth's geomagnetic field, because that is really, I think, very important stuff and also extremely fascinating. And then something I'm also very interested in is the changes in the cosmic environment and how they might be affecting responses in the endogenic environment. In other words, there may be a link between volcanoes and volcanic eruptions and changes in the sun. There's some interesting research out there that seems to be emerging showing this linkage there, and perhaps linkage between seismicity and the geometric arrangement of the entire solar system. So there's this model emerging now that's really looking at the whole solar system as an integrated unit. And I think that's going to be, over the next decade, extremely profoundly valuable and important in understanding that ultimately what's happening here on the surface of the Earth and the world we're experiencing is the end result of a whole confluence of a series of cosmic processes that go beyond the Earth. And I think only then, when we start taking in the bigger picture, are we going to be actually in a position to understand some of the things that are going on. When you talked to Wickramasinghe, did you talk, with this whole coronavirus thing was going on at the time, am I right?
that's right.
So did he have any thoughts about that?
Yes, we the second part of the show was largely about current events, and that he was basically predicting something like this taking place because we're in a deep solar minimum, and he thinks that solar wind helps to keep this kind of thing away from the planet. And so he had actually made predictive papers. Yeah.
So did he say anything specifically about the coronavirus and a possible extraterrestrial connection?
Yeah, he talked about how there was an interesting, like a lack of mutation between distant versions of it, right? So people, they're doing the testing. They're looking at the genome of the virus, or the molecular makeup of the virus from somebody who is in New York and then also somebody in China, and they are almost exactly the same. And that made him think that that the infections came from a monoculture source as opposed to going from person to person to person to person.
Uh-huh.
So
yeah, and there's some information on that. Some of the stuff that he's produced, some papers, and
Yes.
and actually some of these other doctors that are working with Dr. Chandra are also talking about the sequencing of the DNA and looking at why it doesn't appear to have too many differences from one place to another at different points in time. And that's all on the Cosmic Tusk.
Mhm.
So there's a bunch of stuff on the Cosmic Tusk.
yeah, the recent articles on the Cosmic Tusk are very, very good about this.
Well, I need to
subject.
get back over there. Yeah, because really, Cosmic Tusk, the way I'm envisioning is Cosmic Tusk would almost be like a sister website to what we're trying to do here.
Yeah.
So that if you
Yes.
spend, a few weeks or months watching all of our episodes, and then you go over and you spend some time at Cosmic Tusk, going through all of George's material, you'll come away with a pretty good insight and understanding of the whole where we're at now with the Younger Dryas. And of course, as we're putting this together, I've been studying the Younger Dryas for a long time, since the early 90s at least. In fact, I'm going to refer to in a minute. I'm going to refer to some research that I was digging up. Literally, go back to '92 when I was trying to understand, the variety of great catastrophes. So, the two biggies, flood and fire. So, I kind of immersed myself into studies of great floods, the evidence for floods in history, the story of floods in mythology, modern floods, the effect they've had on people, on environments, on landscapes. And then I started looking into the whole thing, the fire, the conflagration, because for example, the Greek Stoics had this kind of binomial version of catastrophism, which was flood and fire. And the term for the Greek term for flood was cataclysmos, started with a kappa, with a K. We use cataclysm now that starts with a C, but it comes from the Greek term cataclysmos. And then the destruction of the world by fire was ekparousis, and that would have been epsilon kappa, I believe. But pyro was the root of the word, ekparousis. So they had cataclysmos and ekparousis, and this was the flood and the fire that alternately destroyed the earth at regular periodic intervals. So, I probably came across those doctrines, God, I don't know, early 80s, maybe reading, maybe even late 70s. Didn't really, of course, back then, there was not the kind of evidence that exists now that basically says and demonstrates, yeah, both of those are literal. Those aren't just allegorical, those are literal. And the perspective we have to have here is, I saw recently, just in the last couple of days, it was a discussion. I think it was on Rational Wiki, which is a lot of BS there from what I've seen. But still, I like to see, okay, what is somebody saying now who is setting themselves out as a proponent, of the accepted orthodoxy. This is it. So basically, it comes back to the idea, which has been around for a long time among those who do, for example, grant to the flood myths this idea that there could be a literal or a historical event behind them. Of course, what it always does is becomes a regional event. Oh, there was this really bad flood in the Tigris or Euphrates River, and somehow that became this myth that the whole world was destroyed, and Utnapishtim or whoever it might have been in that particular myth built an ark, brought the animals on. This was seen as the precursor to the Noah story. Then, of course, you find that these flood myths are all over the world, right? So how do you explain that? I mean, so how do the reductionists explain that? When I say the reductionists, I mean those who are, basically purveyors of the orthodoxy, which is that these were just regional events. Well, it's interesting that when you read the details of these regional events, and then you have this amazing correlation, where you have Native American traditions where there's a great flood, and the survivors do so because they built a great canoe. And the term is a great canoe. Okay. Well, then the standard explanation would be, oh, well, they heard that from missionaries, and then they grafted that into their religious tradition. And like, look, certain things are just so transparently BS that even without the documentation, you can still recognize that it's BS. But when you start looking at some of the early explorers and people, particularly like George Catlin, who, he was the Indian artist. He wrote the book Last Rambles among the, I forget the exact name, Last Rambles, I think, and then it was subtitled, amongst all the Native American tribes. And interestingly, he visited over a period of whatever decades, like 100 different tribes, reported the same thing. He said, and I'll pull up this quote at some point because it's such a great quote. And it comes right at the end of his book, which was about what he learned about the cultures of the native peoples in North America and Central America. And he said, well, there's a whole diversity of traditions and languages and beliefs and stuff, but there is one thing that is consistent among every tribe he visited. And that was their belief that they were descended from ancestors who survived a great catastrophe that wiped out everybody else, basically. Right? So you see parallels in the so-called New World and you see in the Old World. And the explanation that it was a diffusion process, that the missionaries came over, told these stories, the native peoples were so impressed by it that they said, hey, let's modify our religion to, graft this in because it's so interesting. No, what happened when they came over and told those stories, the native people said, well, we have those stories already. You see, yeah, we know those stories. Our cultural ancestor was so-and-so, Manny Bozo or whoever it might have been that survived the Great Flood. So the thing is now we have to look at it, and here's, I think, the perspective. You have on the one end of that, you have the skeptics, the reductionists, who basically try to explain it away by saying, oh, it was just, it was, in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, there was a big flood one year, bigger than normal, 4,000 or 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. And now they're still telling the stories about it. It became, exaggerated into this, much, much bigger thing through the retelling, because it kept getting told and retold and retold. Each time it got retold, it got bigger. It got more impressive, right? Until it finally came the whole world, right? But really, originally, it was just a bad flood that, flooded the Euphrates Valley, but had nothing to do with somebody living up in Europe or in Asia or North or South America, right? Well, the thing is, though, and then on the other end of the spectrum, you've got the evangelical Christians who don't need any scientific explanation, who've accepted in toto the model of the universal flood, and all it requires is just the supernatural intervention of the Lord God Almighty. It doesn't require any scientific explanation behind it. It's just there. It's a universal flood. The waters rise and drown the entire world, even up to the highest mountains. And I've tried to understand where they explain the water came from and where it went eventually. And there's where we get kind of fuzzy. And then we get into some serious fuzzy logic there. But so that's kind of that's it. That, those are the two models we were given, right? So, okay, we can accept this. We can take the fundamentalist model and we don't need, it's supernatural. It's God's, miracle. He can do whatever he wants, right? On the other end, it's just a regional flood. The reality is that there have been hydrological events that can only be measured in the hundreds of millions of cubic feet per second. Now, when you're talking about a hydrological event that is on that scale, you're talking about, let's just cite an example in some of the sites that we're going to visit on the Scablands tour. For example, there's a place called, help me with this, Brad, there, just below Potholes Cataract, the 9-10 mile wide tract. of,
Oh, Drumheller channels.
thank you, Drumheller Channels. There's a place there called Drumheller Channels. It's where a sheet of water came down over the Columbia Basalt Plateau and it spilled over a rim. There was a change in gradient, right? So, gradient affects the velocity. The erosional capacity of moving water is a function of the velocity. So obviously, if it's a slower moving stream, it's not going to be erosive, right? As the gradient increases, the velocity increases, the erosive potential increases. Right there's this rim, slightly a tilt in the basalt. So you go from a shallower pitch to a greater pitch, right? Well, right at that spot, you had a stream of water that was about 400 feet deep and 10 miles wide. And as it's starting to spill over that rim, it's moving now probably on the slower gradient, 40 to 50 miles an hour. Once it hits that rim and starts going to steeper gradient, it's probably now going 60 to 80 miles an hour. And then you can see this entire plexus, the Drumheller channels, where it begins to sweep away the landscape. Hundreds of feet of the landscape just gets swept away, right? What's left is called the Butan Basin topography, where, if you've got a landscape, let's say in this case it's basalt bedrock, within that basalt bedrock, there are lots of fractures, fissures, weak zones of weakness. This flowing water is going to exploit those zones of weakness first. So you got this basalt bedrock there that will be, pretty planar, planar, planar. You got a fracture. So the water begins to exploit that fracture and it begins to erode, and that fracture literally turns into a canyon. Now, maybe a half a mile away, you got another fracture and the water is eroding that as well. Now, what will happen is as the water eats away the sides, and this is water that's loaded with abrasive sediment, it's gushing along at 50 or 60 miles an hour. So, I mean, it's stripping big time. So it's enlarging the channels. Now you got a channel here, you got a channel over here. As it's enlarging, what's happening? The area in between, which the technical term is interfluve, in between the flow, right? Interfluve is getting eroded away. Now, let's suppose that the spigots get turned off. The source of water for this flood is depleted. Well, now what happens is whatever stage of erosion that landscape is at, it now becomes a frozen landscape. It becomes an extinct landscape, right? The great floods sweep away. They rip stuff up, and then as the water eventually, wherever it is in its pathway to the ocean, it begins to slow down. It now drops, it deposits that sediment. So what you're going to see when you follow the path of a great flood like this is a succession of areas where it's been eroded, and then that will be followed by an area where that material has been deposited. Okay, so now here's what I'm getting at. 10 miles wide, 400 feet deep. Well, that's just in this one pathway. When you look at the whole area of Basalt Plateau, there was a temporary submergence of almost the entire plateau, right? So now anybody living in that plateau, and there certainly, I think, were. I mean, I think we could conclude that there were people living there, from what we know now about the Clovis inhabitation of North America, right? But there would have been nobody living there afterwards, unless, of course, somebody's in a place. Let's say you're over there in just outside of Missoula, Montana. Now, just there in Missoula, Montana, there's the Missoula Basin. And if you're standing there in the town of Missoula on the campus of the University of Montana there are two mountains, Mountain Sentinel and Mount Jumbo, after Jumbo named after an elephant because apparently its back reminded somebody of a big elephant. Well, if you're standing there on the floor of the Missoula Basin on the university campus there, and you're looking up on the sides of these two mountains, you see horizontal etch lines, right? Those are called strand lines in geological nomenclature. They're basically extinct beaches. Now, a beach, maybe you would think of something that's produced over a long term. I would argue that what we're seeing there are simply lines that represent the declining, the pauses in the declining and the draining away of the floodwater. But the point is the highest one is 1,000 feet above your head, right? Now, go 1,000 feet up, that means that the water was up that level. So whoever was occupying, whatever animals or whatever people was occupying the Missoula Basin, and the evidence is that it was a what you would call a boreal forest. That means spruce trees, alder trees, larch trees, poplars, right? Probably loaded with game, probably got cold, right? But it was probably still a pretty good place to live. I mean, in another, whatever, 50 miles north, you had the Flathead Lobe terminus where Flathead Lake is, and that would have been regularly seasonal melting. So there'd been rivers coming down. Those rivers are probably loaded with fish. Anyways, you're living in this valley. Now, suddenly one day you hear this rumbling and you don't know what it is. And then the ground starts shaking. And the next thing you know is 400, 500, 600-foot wall of water comes washing into the basin. Well, if you're down on the floor, you're history, you're gone. But let's say you were up on the top of Mount Jumbo or Mount Sentinel because the water didn't reach the top. It's probably another couple hundred feet of mountain up above that highest strand line, right? Let's suppose that by the luck of the draw, whatever, you're up there one day, you're hunting or something, you're up on the top, all of this happens, you take shelter. Now let's forget all the other possibilities that might be going on, like the atmosphere might be on fire and there might be crap raining down out of the heavens, whatever. But let's say you manage to take shelter. After all of this is over, a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks later, you come out and what's left of your world? Not a damn thing. Not a damn thing. As far as the eye can see, in every direction is devastation. You come out, you and a small band of survivors, you spend days, even weeks walking, right? Because that's all you got, and nothing but devastation. So now your traditions are basically that the world was destroyed. But 50 miles away, there's another group of survivors who are seeing exactly the same kind of a thing and assuming, because you don't know. You have no way of knowing what's going on 50 miles away unless you walk there, basically. So in a sense, what we're saying is that we now can scientifically demonstrate that there are floods, not that universally drown the whole planet, but can destroy a world. That's my point. And we're finding more and more evidence globally that these kinds of floods have occurred. And believe me, we're going to get into that. We're going to get into breaking down. We're going to analyze the myths, and then we're going to look at the science for all these various mechanisms by which worlds are destroyed, right? Whether it's by flood or it's by fire. And interestingly, when we go back to the Younger Dryas, we see both of these factors converging. We see flood and we see fire on a massive scale, unimaginably. And just as we're learning, the 50% of the great megafauna didn't survive. We also begin to see evidence, and I haven't gotten into all of it, but I mean, evidence continues to emerge that there was also a human population bottleneck. Maybe not leaving the kind of genetic signature that we would look for if we want to say, okay, if the entire human population was reduced to a few tens of thousands of people, right? However, if these people are scattered about the planet, yeah, we shouldn't necessarily look for that genetic similarity. If you have survivors of the Altai mountain flood, living in what is now Mongolia, right? You've got a group there, and then you've got a group over in North America or South America. That's the point, is you might have a pretty broad diversity of survivors in these various isolated groups. But I think that begins to really fit this model that we've been looking at, the disappearance of the Clovis culture and the who had left their layer of artifacts, in the landscape. Clearly a signature of their presence there for 200 to 300 to 400 years. What's interesting about that is they show up, they're suddenly there, they're quarrying their stone to make their very unique spear points. They've got their campsites. They're leaving their evidence in 70 sites around, back up, 50 some sites around unglaciated North America. And then right at the window with the megafauna gone, they disappear. but there's a difference, and this to me is a question that needs to be looked into, which is this: we find the remains of the mastodon, we find remains of Mammuthus columbi, Mammuthus primigenius, we find the remains of Arctodus simus, of Ursus spalius, of Camelops, of Castoroides, all of these magnificent beasts, the dire wolves, right? We find their remains. Where are the remains of the Clovis? I mean, the Anzac girl, teenage girl, is that the only one? I don't know. To me, that's something that needs to be probed into. Where are the remains of where are the actual skeletal remains or mortal remains of the Clovis people?
Yeah, that question haunts me for sure.
Yeah. Kyle, we're counting on you to come up with something, man.
Mike found the name of the book, by the way, Last Rambles Amongst the Indians of the Rocky Mountains and the Andes.
Thank you. Say it one more time. Last Rambles.
Last Rambles Amongst the Indians of the Rocky Mountains and the Andes.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Available on
Randall's.
Available on Amazon.
It is available still. Okay. Now, when I first encountered the book, it was not available. You know, when I was researching a lot of this stuff for the first time in the 70s and 80s, you had to like physically get up and go to a library.
You could call the library.
A lot of people now don't know what that means anymore, to have like actually physically have to get up and go to a library and like have to have a library card. But you did.
You can spread viruses with library cards. It's just not a good idea.
Very dangerous. Yeah.
Yeah. Those were back in the barbaric days, you know, when you actually had
I still have a library card for our town library. It's a great place. So
yeah, and then you had to go into the card catalog.
Yes,
that was brutal.
Dewey Decimal System.
Yeah, the Dewey Decimal System. Yes, how many of us suffered through the Dewey Decimal System?
Yeah. I also wanted to point out, when you were talking about the flow of water and its erosive qualities, 400 feet deep at the bottom of that is, I mean, it's going to be a couple of hundred psi, right? So you got.
Oh yeah.
What's the water pressure at 400 feet deep?
Well, it's
like 180 to 190.
Oh, probably in that range,
like
because
that.
Yeah, probably in that range. Yeah.
So that's 200 pounds per square inch.
Yes, and then the shear forces from that water, I mean, are going to be inconceivable. And then, of course, when you actually see the Drumheller channels, and you have this picture in your mind, you go, "Oh, I'm starting to get it now."
Right.
Yeah. Brad, do we have any drone? Do we have drone footage of the Drumhellers yet?
No.
Oh, that's going to be
what?
That's going to be rich. Ooh, yeah.
Yeah, we may have to get some approval from the big airport that's right there, though.
Oh, right. But it's got to be done. Somehow we've got to figure out a way to do it.
There'll be a way, but yeah, we have to get some approval.
Just get forgiveness.
Yeah. Don't get permission. Get forgiveness. Brad and I are going to have drone wars because we both have a drone.
I can hear you guys droning on now.
So I do have I don't know, this could be part of the reason why we haven't found any Clovis skeletons, but I mean, a lot of sites, like if you find remains, you have to turn that over to the Bureau of Ethnology, and then they get to decide whether there's actual DNA testing done on it or whatever, or they may want to rebury the body. So it's possible that there could have been multiple excavations of skeletons that just never were tested, so we couldn't confirm whether or not they were Clovis people.
Well, of course,
that's possible.
Would have been, if there were skeletons found, I think we could safely assume that there would have been some that were found before implementation of the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act.
That's a good point.
Which I think is 80s. But if that's the case, where are these? Are they in the vaults in museums down in the sub basement? I don't know.
Yeah, they got Smithsonianed.
Yeah, they've been Smithsonian. They just disappear.
They've been Smithsonianized.
It's a verb. Yeah.
Smithsonian. And I mean, 80s, when were we able to do genetic testing? The NAGPRA shows up in the 80s, but that's right around when we started to be able to.
Yeah, exactly.
So, yeah.
Well, I am of the mind that anything that's 9 or 10 or 11 or 12,000 years old really is the heritage of all mankind.
Yeah.
I really do. I mean, I totally respect Native American traditions. I do. Yet I've heard some Native Americans themselves say, yeah, we're interested in what this shows. We're interested in the science. So if there's not a, again, everything gets politicized, but in this case, what we would learn is so damn important, the lessons, like, because that question, what happened to the Clovis people? We know that the Kennewick man was post-Clovis, right? Yet the Kennewick man was found in very late stage flood sediments along the Columbia River, right there near Wallula Gap. And I know I haven't followed the controversy lately, but there was a long time where there was a lot of controversy, and there was a movement to prevent the DNA testing and the age testing of the Kennewick man.
So part of my conspiracy theory on the Anzac 1 thing is that whoever did that testing, they did it out of order. They didn't report it first.
Mm-hmm.
They just went and had the tests done.
Mm-hmm.
And then they reported it to the Bureau or whatever.
Uh-huh.
As far as I remember.
So you think there might have been some funny business in there? Is that what you're...
Maybe.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like the fact that that's the only one, and that it wasn't reported, and they went and did the DNA test without, reporting that they'd found the remains first to the Bureau is maybe why it's the only one, is my point.
Yeah. Well, that the terrace that the Kennewick man was found on, there might have been more, but shortly after the find, the Corps of Engineers went in and dumped like hundreds, if not thousands of tons of rubble on the site.
Yeah.
Supposedly to protect the site. Well, I mean,
right.
What? That's like, you destroy the village to save it.
Yeah.
There's
a pretty extensive and very interesting article on the Kennewick man at Smithsonian.com. Very well done. I recommend anybody look it up. That describes the whole process from discovery all the way to the very end, and how they had to fight back and forth on, whether they would be able to do any testing on it or any studies at all. And they eventually got 24 hours.
Yeah.
Only 24 hours. And after that, the whole thing was reburied and covered in concrete and just...
that's insanity. And that's political correctness gone insane.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, anything that old, I mean, I'm sorry, it's the common heritage of mankind. And I think it would be wonderful if we could demonstrate that there was a lineage between somebody 10 or 11 or 12,000 years old and modern tribes. I think that would be wonderful. But, I mean, the genetic evidence is going to show that it was or that it wasn't. So if it was, great, that's awesome. You guys have got ancestors. We can now demonstrably prove that you've got these ancestors that go back thousands and thousands of years. And if not, well, then who are these people? And if not, then that certainly does put it in the realm of mankind's common heritage, because 10,000 years, that's a hell of a long time. And let's see, 10,000 years, we could say that is about 400 generations.
Yeah, that's...
if we assume 25 years for a generation. So a lot can happen over 400 generations.
Yeah. I want to read this part from the Wikipedia on Anzac 1, just to clarify what I was saying. So
let's do.
It says Anzac 1's discovery and subsequent analysis has been controversial. The remains were found on private land, so the researchers did not violate the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act in their study. But many Native American tribal members in Montana believe they should have been consulted before the researchers undertook analysis of the infant's skeleton, genome. So, so they didn't break the rules. So, yeah.
So, okay. Well, it would have been fine to consult them, but I mean, to what
would
end?
There have been a Kennewick man fight over that?
That's what. Yeah, I mean, that would be my first question.
And then maybe we wouldn't know if it was, so I don't, it's.
And I think those kind of policies are, they always have the wrong effect.
Yeah,
Like
they're detrimental to.
right. You do something like
Yeah.
take the Kennewick man, and then no one wants to
That's
tell
the
you.
doctrine of unintended consequences.
Exactly. Then people
Yeah.
are going to hide it from you in the future, and then you don't get what you want.
Yeah. So on private land, if somebody were to discover some remains, it'd be like, just cover it up. Just don't say
tell
anything.
anybody.
And then we don't know anything about
Yeah,
it. So
right.
it has a detrimental effect.
And it's my opinion that those events and what the effect they would have had upon the native inhabitants of North America at that time are so critically important, such a critically important part of our human past on Earth. We need to know, we need to understand what happened. And we've come a long way in the last few decades, but we still don't really know what happened. I mean, obviously something from outside seems to be, we seem to be vectoring in on a model that involves a fragmented comet. And I think at this point that makes the most sense for multiple reasons. And because there are other systems of belief out there that have different alternate explanations. That's why in science, you need to definitively demonstrate that one, let's say, hypothesis is going to be superior to another one because it explains the evidence in a much more straightforward, simple fashion and makes sense out of that evidence. Because again, one of the scientific dictums is that usually the simplest explanation is going to be the best. So yeah, I mean, we've got some contending hypotheses here. I mean, there are some people who say, well, no, that the craters that we see, the holes in the ground aren't caused by impacts, right? They're caused by lightning bolts.
Not the electric universe theory again, please.
Well, I'm just citing that as a salient example of why it's important to really put out the data and the evidence and look at it, critically, but really to build a case. That's why people, I kind of lose patience sometimes with people when it's like some people, when you're there and you're presenting something and I'm trying to lay out the case. And one of the things I'm trying to avoid doing is contaminating the evidence with my interpretation of it. I've got my thoughts about what this could mean or not mean. But then there are the folks who just want to go, let's cut to the chase. Let's just tell us what it all means. And well, first of all, I don't know what it all means. I've got some thoughts on it, but what I'm doing here is I want to lay out the evidence and see what conclusion you come to. Let's see if you looking at the same evidence that I'm looking at comes to the same conclusions or the same conjectures as I do. Let's see that. I'm interested in seeing that. I'm not interested in just spoon feeding you some interpretation of it, That doesn't get us anywhere. What I want is I want you to look at the evidence on your own, come to your own conclusion, I might be wrong. I'm probably not, but I might be.
So
I don't rule it out 100%.
Mike, you're the normal guy. So are you coming to this? What conclusions are you coming to?
The only thing I'll say about Mike very quickly is for several years now, Mike has been hammering home to me the idea, and he could be right, hammering home the idea that I'm not thinking big enough.
That's true.
Well, I was going to say, when you were going through that, I'm just thinking like, well, Randall, tell us more about what happened. I know we don't know what happened, but tell us more.
That is funny because I was thinking the same thing. I was like, maybe we should have a recap. Like, I want you to just paint the picture. Tell us like how everything exploded and caught on fire and got drowned and frozen.
But what we're going to do is we're going to look at the evidence.
Right.
We're going to look at the evidence and we're going to learn some new terms. We're going to learn about, some of the proxies for reconstructing a conflagration, a great conflagration. Because the studies now, I've got several of them that are very, very, very good. This is one of them here that I've been reading. It came out a couple of years ago. Now, of course, I'm seeing this backwards, but you can see it's a very long, distinguished list of scientists. Let's see.
Is that the biomass burning paper? Is that what that is?
Yeah, extraordinary biomass burning episode
Right.
and impact winter, triggered by the Younger Dryas cosmic impact 12,800 years ago. Part 1, the evidence that's in ice cores and glaciers. And here, number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, there's right here, right at the top, is our good buddy George Howard.
Yeah.
And we got to get some more of these folks on the show to, to edify us and educate us about what they're doing.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, all right. Well, I think we should take a quick break.
I agree.
And we'll come back and go wherever you're going to take us.
Also, I just bought that book. I'm going to read it. The Last Rambles Amongst the Indians. Looks
Oh,
like a good
okay.
one. Yeah.
Well, you'll see that my favorite part of the book is what he does right at the very end when he talks about the Native American. In fact, if on the break you wanted to look that up and read that, I think that would be really. It's only like a half a page.
Okay, I'll find it. All right.
We'll be back, ladies and gentlemen. All right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. I think we're going to kick off this segment with a excerpt from the book. What was that? No, I lost the name of it already. Last Rambles Amongst the Indians of the Rocky Mountains and the Andes.
Mm-hmm.
George Catlin.
George Catlin. Caitlin, right?
I think that's right.
If I remember right, yep.
Yeah, so
I read this book. I'm going to guess that I read this book maybe very early 1980s. And of course, it was written, do you have the date? 1870s?
I can find it after I read these excerpts.
Sure. Okay. So just so people have this context of where this is coming from. This is not something that was written.
Right. It's not recent. Yeah.
Yeah. He spent time with these tribes that he's writing about. Decades. And this is now he's in his later years. It's after the Civil War, and he's writing this down, this journalistic account of his last rambles. And so he kind of concludes his work with presenting these ideas you're about to address with these quotes.
Right. The last 3 chapters are the Indians. Who are they? Where do they come from? And where are they going?
Yeah.
And this comes from chapter 10, the Indians, who are they? So it says, the American Indians, their traditions and monuments prove, beyond a doubt, their great antiquity. For of the 120 different tribes which I have visited in North and South and Central America, every tribe has related to me, more or less distinctly, their traditions of the deluge, in which 1 or 3 or 8 persons were saved above the waters on the top of a high mountain, and also their peculiar and respective theories of the creation. Some of these tribes, living at the base of the Rocky Mountains and in the plains of Venezuela and the Pampa del Sacramento in South America, make annual pilgrimages to the fancied summits where the antediluvian species were saved in canoes or otherwise, and, under the mysterious regulations of their medicine men, tender their prayers and sacrifices to the Great Spirit to ensure their exemption from a similar catastrophe.
Mm-hmm.
And then later he says, amongst all these tribes, as well as amongst the present Mexicans and the numerous tribes to the north, even to the Kiowas and the Comanches, I have found distinct traditions of 3 successive cataclysms, 2 by water and 1 by fire. And in the rocks and mountains, both in the West India Islands and on the Mexican coast, as well as in the Yucatan and its ruins, I have found, from chemical and geological tests, undeniable evidences of the same catastrophes.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
So I would venture to say that George Catlin was considerably ahead of his time. And of course, he wasn't in that milieu. He was not the only one who was thinking in terms of catastrophes. even though the last couple of decades of the 19th century saw the decline of catastrophic models and the total dominance of gradualistic models once geological science became academicized and dogmas were established that were part of the teaching, a part of the curriculum of, standardized Earth history. And so, of course, now in retrospect, I think we can see that a lot of the early geologists who were willing to think, and Caitlin wasn't a geologist, but he was an acute observer of nature, and that a lot of these people back then were really, in their own way, had a more realistic conception of Earth history than the later strictly uniformitarian models. Did you find a date on that book, Russ?
I'm looking for it. It just, all it says is that he did his travels during the 1800s, but I'm trying to find when the book was actually published.
Okay.
So I'm looking for it.
That shouldn't be too hard to find.
Yeah, unfortunately, it wasn't with the actual Kindle book. I couldn't find it in there. Okay, originally published 1867.
Wow.
1867?
Was when it was originally published.
Oh, okay. I knew it was post-Civil War. I thought maybe it was a little later than that, but yeah. So then that means that he did most of his travels with the Indians before the Civil War. And so
that's even more impressive for him. He would have been traveling like the 1840s and 50s.
Yes. And a lot of the tribes that he visited, he was the first white man, right? He was the first European man. So he's hearing these traditions. So clearly it's not something that was grafted into their religious heritage by having heard accounts of Christian missionaries. So that, maybe in some cases they grafted things on, most likely because when they heard those accounts, they said, oh, well, that's 3, 5, 8. Well, our account is 8 people survived. And now you're telling me that Noah and his wife and his 3 sons and their 3 wives, 8 people. Oh yeah. So you're got the same story. So yeah, we're basically telling the same story. So yeah, we might graft on some of the details that you have preserved. So in that sense, yeah, it's very possible. But to say that we can dismiss the native accounts, the accounts of the indigenous peoples because, they just heard it from missionaries and that's all it is. Well, no, we can't do that.
But when they also have traditions of going to specific mountains and performing rituals so that it never happens again, because that was the mountain where they were saved, that's a little beyond like learning a story from a missionary and adopting it into your culture.
Yes.
Right?
And yet I have read that has been very typical. When the academic reductionist types are looking at those myths to the extent that they give them any attention at all, that's usually, the standard response. Baldo, I think we're moving away from that. Last decade, 2 decades, we're seeing, the work of Bruce Massey and the emergence of geomythology, which is basically just like astromythology, the idea that some of these traditions about the earth and the sky actually have scientific merit to them, and that the stories are basically encoded versions of things that people once upon a time experienced directly. So,
and what I find fascinating too is the whole idea of verbal histories, oral histories.
Oral history, yes.
They're for a long time they weren't given much credence, but oral history practitioners, they sit and they learn this stuff by rote. It's drilled into them from generation to generation. The same thing was true with the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. Mm-hmm. Before it was ever written down, it was an oral tradition.
It was an oral tradition.
Yep.
And we're saving this, but at some point we'll get into looking at some of these accounts. It's very interesting to, for example, go into the Noah account, the Noahite account, for example, going back to the original tongues, the original Hebrew. And one of the things you discover is that, in the book of Genesis, there's actually 2 distinct narratives that are interwoven. This is well known amongst scholars of the Old Testament. But there are just like there are two distinct accounts of the creation, there are two distinct accounts of the destruction that are interwoven. And once you start teasing those apart, you get some very interesting contrasting details between the two accounts. So yeah, that's worth exploring. And when you go into the original languages, the original accounts that were written down in these old Semitic languages, the really interesting thing to me is this idea, particularly this is one of the ideas that comes from Kabbalah, is that underlying the literal interpretation of the Bible is another dimension that involves taking the literal, peeling it back, and looking at a mathematical layer underlying the literal accounts. And the mechanism by which that works is pretty simple, really. It's just that before the advent of the Hindu-Arabic numeral system, in the Semitic languages, the same set of symbols served the dual purpose. On the one hand, they were letters of the alphabet, but on the other hand, they were numerical symbols.
This is gematria. Is that what you're?
Gematria is the system of translating, taking the original, like in the Hebrew alphabet or the Greek alphabet, because they both had these numerical attributes to them, is basically substituting in the numerical values. And then what would happen is you get a word or a name or a phrase that would have a value. So, initially one might go, well, that's more of this, fringe kind of, don't know the word I'm looking for, but basically.
Numerology.
What?
Numerology.
Yeah, like it's numerology.
Yeah.
However, once you start looking into it, you realize that there's way more there than can be, there's way more. The correlations that you get are quite extraordinary. And that would be something that would be really fun to get into, because I've got all the original text of a lot of these old writings, and obviously there's a way more than I've done, but I've done enough to make some very interesting discoveries about the underlying geometry, the numbers that continually emerge when you start substituting in these keywords and phrases, and the relationships amongst the numbers are beyond coincidence. I mean, if it's coincidence, then we're faced with almost having to come up with a new definition for the coincidence. Right? What does it even mean anymore?
Right.
And I've got hundreds of examples, hundreds and hundreds of examples. And just a few of those, we could spend an hour and a half going through some of those sometime. And, when we get into like the numbers associated with the flood, the numbers associated with, because, you think about the Bible, there's a lot of stuff in there from a bunch of different authors, right? And it covers the gamut from all kinds of stuff. But it opens, you've got this creation account, which is really a replenishment. That's clear. It's the English translation uses a meaning that's consistent with the original Hebrew word, which is a replenishment, a restoration, which implies that there was something before. And then we have the introduction of the Great Flood, right? So this is how the whole account opens, and then it ends with the apocalypsis, the apocalypse. So the beginning is the destruction by water, and the end is destruction by fire. And these are the bookends. Right. And I kind of think that the whole point of all of this is just to tie these two things together. And then when you look at the prophecies, what are the prophecies? Well, the prophecies are all dealing with these apocalyptic events, right? But I think that what we're dealing with here with the idea of prophecy is that it's prophecy like this. Okay, we're sitting here right now. It's April. It was winter, right? I can make a prophecy about the weather, the climate, the changing environment, for 3 months from now or 6 months from now. 6 months from now, I prophesy that we will be coming into a condition of global cooling, that the climate will cool down. The sun will get lower in the sky, and the shadows will get longer, and the weather will get cold. And you see, and everybody's going to know exactly what I'm talking about, because we're all experiencing the annual cycle, right? We know the annual cycle. We know what happened. I can make a prophecy now. Here I'm sitting here, and it's getting close to midnight in Georgia. I'm going to make a prophecy. In 12 hours, there's going to be brilliant sunlight, and it's going to be cascading down, and we're going to be able to see everything in great detail. Here's what I think prophecy is. I think prophecy is simply making educated guesses about what's most likely going to be happening in the future because of the exhaustive and extensive knowledge of what has happened in the past, and that it's cyclical in nature. So
right, let me interrupt you there.
Okay.
In biblical terms, that's not what prophecy is. Prophecy is not fortune telling.
Of course.
In biblical terms,
is it fortune telling for me to say, that
no, in biblical terms, a prophet is someone basically who warns not of ill things to come, but warns people of their behavior. If you look at the ancient,
I don't know if you read Isaiah, he's pretty clear about warning things about, warning people about what's to come. And here's the thing, they do tie it in with people's behavior. And that makes sense in a way, because look, when we get into, talking about fires, we're going to go into some of the great fires in recent history. We'll talk about the Peshtigo fire, which was the most devastating forest fire in American history. Maybe as many as 2,000 people were consumed in that fire. It's an incredible story. But one of the things that in reading these accounts, one of the things that I would discover over and over again is that there's this village of Peshtigo, right? It's on the right on the next to the Green Bay on Lake Michigan, right up on the western shores of Green Bay, right? So this is October 8th, 1871. So you read these accounts, right? And some of the accounts of the survivors are talking about how some of the people in the village had this ominous sense in the days leading up to this tremendous firestorm that burst out of the forest, right? And even up to within an hour, a couple of hours before the outbreak of this cataclysmic firestorm that swept upon these people so fast that they couldn't escape it, right? What they said was that half the people in the village were out looking at the sky, looking and having this ominous sense of impending catastrophe. The other half were going about their business merrily, not paying any attention to what was going on, right? Next door to this priest who wrote an account, there was a group of people having a tea party outside, right? There was a couple of saloons down in the town. People are going in and out of the saloon, making noise, shouting, drinking, all of this, right? There was regular activity going on, and then you had half the people basically going about oblivious to the signs and the omens that everybody else, the other half, was picking up on. So in the moments before this fire tornadoes, fire cyclones swept out of the forest and literally annihilated the whole town in a matter of minutes, these people went down to the river and they took refuge in the river. And guess who survived? Those people. Those people are the ones who survived. Within 5 minutes, the other half of the town, 1,500 people, somewhere around there, 12 to 1,500 people in that town alone, had been incinerated, had basically been reduced to ashes. Now, this is a story we're going to get into great detail because the eyewitness accounts of this are so dramatic and powerful, it'll blow you away. Then, after that, we will actually confer to some of the traditional accounts, and we'll take some right out of the Bible, some out of other myths and stories. The parallels are uncanny. But here's my point. My point is that prophecy to me is the interpretation of those omens that are there for everybody to see, but that most people aren't paying attention to, right? So I look at prophecy as not as some supernatural process, but it's just it's really just being in tune. It's being in tune with nature and knowing that it's cyclical. When you read Isaiah, go ahead, read Isaiah, then read the book of Revelation, and you realize that, okay, Isaiah is Old Testament prophet, but Apocalypse is New Testament, but they're basically describing the same type of thing and using the same type of language. Then go and read the accounts, which we will do, of the survivors of Tunguska, the survivors of other cosmic impacts, whose accounts we have a record of. The survivors of some of these great firestorms, like Peshtigo or Hinckley, or the big fire of 1910 in Idaho. And you know what you'll see over and over and over again? People describing these events in apocalyptic biblical terms, because they're grasping for something to try to, some terminology, some words that can convey the power and the sense of drama that they experienced through these events. And so what do? They turn to this apocalyptic interpretation of things, and you see it over. So you can put up an account, Isaiah describing the destruction of the world, or St. John the Divine describing the destruction of the world. Put that right next to the survivor, an eyewitness survivor of Tunguska, and then tell me that there's no parallels between the two. So we're talking about fire, right? So let's go back to 1992. Now we could go back earlier than this, of course, but there was a couple of scientists, M. Legrand and M. D. Angelis, who in 1992 published a paper. And what they had done was, in 1992, you got to understand this is just when those really highly accurate Greenland ice cores were first extracted and were being studied, right? Now, everybody kind of, I think, understands what a tree ring is and how you get the layered buildup of the Cambria to form the layers of the tree. Well, when you're talking about ice cores, you've got annual deposition of snow that forms these layers of ice that can actually be counted with a high degree of precision. So this is now 1992. The ice core projects have drawn out these two long ice cores from the summit of Greenland ice core. Now, there had been previously century ice core expeditions and things that had drawn out cores, but those cores were closer to the perimeter of the ice sheet, where the ice action was and movement was far more dynamic. So what they wanted to do was go to the ice core, where the summit, where the ice was the thickest and most stable. So there they could get the most accurate determination of the year-by-year basis, right? So they go down through there, they pull this out. Okay, so now they start looking at these layers, and they see that in some layers there are say dust, real dusty. Other layers are not so dusty. When they look chemically, they find chemical substances in some of the. For example, they find evidence of sulfate aerosols. Well, you got a layer, and suddenly there's this huge spike of sulfate in that layer. Well, that means almost certainly that somewhere on the Earth there was a huge volcanic eruption. The sulfates circled around the globe, deposited out, and are now preserved between those sandwiched layers of the Greenland ice sheet, right? So now this paper was published in 1992, March of 1992, in the Geophysical Research Letters, right? Here's what they say: biomass burning is influencing the atmospheric chemistry by emitting large amounts of reactive species, such as hydrocarbons, organic acids, and nitrogen compounds. Polar ice cores provide a unique record of precipitation whose chemistry reflects the atmospheric composition at the time of deposition. The analysis of such ice samples, therefore, allows an estimate to be made of the concentration of atmospheric impurities in the past. So during the first season of the deep drill operation, GRIP, Greenland Ice Sheet Project, at Summit, Greenland, they found a big spike of ammonium, NH4. So they looked for this ammonium between 100 and 600 meters in depth. And this covered the period from 330 years ago to 2,500 years ago. So you're 600, you're 1,800 feet down in the ice. And this is ice that was formed, deposited as snow right around 2,500 years ago. So the normal is that the ammonium concentrations have seasonal variations of about 1 to 20 nanograms per gram, which is not very much, right? However, within that, there are these sporadic values that are as high as 600 nanograms per gram that are confined to these narrow layers. So the authors of this say that this chemical fingerprint points to biomass burning, causing the high ammonium peaks. Ammonium will be emitted originally as ammonia, whereas the organic acids are emitted directly and are also produced in the atmosphere by the oxidation of hydrocarbons. The ammonium peaks in the summit core must be caused by a source which emits ammonia, organic acids, or hydrocarbons on a time scale of days to perhaps a month. Additionally, the emissions must occur in such a way that they have the possibility to reach Greenland. Only biomass burning, and more specifically, large forest fires, satisfy the above-mentioned conditions. Plumes from forest fires have enough energy that they can extend to the free troposphere, where they can be efficiently transported over large distances. The comprehensive study of ammonium perturbations observed in Greenland snow layers have shown that such summer events are characterized by a large increase of several organic species. The study of the Greenland precipitation suggests that the composition of the atmosphere in high northern latitudes has been sporadically disturbed by strong inputs originating from high latitude forest fires. Such perturbations are 1 or 2 orders of magnitude above the normal atmospheric content of reactive species. And so then they go on to say, they conclude that this study also points out the possibility of reconstructing past biomass burning events in the northern latitudes, which could have been modulated by past climatic conditions. So this was where they were laying the groundwork for this study that has led now to other things, which we have this study here, which I showed earlier, which is extremely interesting. The study led by lead author Wendy S. Wolbach, who did a lot of the work on looking at the evidence for biomass burning at the KT boundary, the dinosaur extinction boundary. So this is entitled Extraordinary Biomass Burning, Episode and Impact Winter, triggered by the Younger Dryas cosmic impact 12,800 years ago. So that's kind of honing in on the more accurate dating. It's being adjusted as they learn more. Although I think one of the things that seems to be coming out of the studies is that, and the critics were right about this. Well, it wasn't one singular event. It seems that we actually have a series of a cluster of events. I think that's what we're looking at here, and that's one of the things that's making it difficult to interpret the evidence, is because we aren't looking at a single event. We're looking at a cluster of events, a concentrated cluster, so yeah, this is been added a level of difficulty here. So then we had that came out in 2008 as a follow-up to the 2007 paper by Richard Firestone. This is Doug Kennett and James Kennett, and what about Alan West is on it. Thomas Stafford, which you guys have had some communication with Thomas Stafford, right? About Hall's Cave.
Hall's Cave, that's right.
Yeah, and he sounds like a pretty good fellow, right? I mean, he sounds like might be interesting to try to get him on the show.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, he was a co-author of this paper that I'm looking at here. It's called, now this is evidence, but it's not from the Greenland ice cores. We'll come back to that. This is looking at, we talked about the Northern Channel Islands when we were talking about Santa Rosa and some of the evidence. So 3 or 4 shows ago, 5 shows, I don't even remember. We already have talked about some of this work on these islands off the west coast of California. So in this particular paper, it's entitled Wildfire and Abrupt Ecosystem Disruption on California's Northern Channel Islands at the Alarad Younger Dryas boundary. And then in parentheses, it's got 13.0 to 12.9 Ka, K meaning 1,000, A meaning years. Now, with more refined dating in the last 11 years, it's now bumped a little bit sooner, a little bit more modern than 12.9, into the somewhere between 12.8 and 12.9. But that doesn't in any way delegitimize the idea. So they open the paper, this is their introduction. Abrupt and massive environmental and biotic changes are evident at the Alarad Younger Dryas boundary in the archaeological and paleontological records of North America. So I'll just jump through a couple of highlights here. Sedimentary records from the Northern Channel Islands and the Santa Barbara Basin, which is on the mainland, indicate intense regional wildfires and abrupt ecosystem disruption at the Alarad Younger Dryas boundary. This time interval coincides with a last possible of M. exilus, Mammuthus exilus, which was the pygmy mammoth that inhabited these islands, and marks the beginning of an apparent 600 to 800 year gap in the archaeological record. So we've been talking about the emerging evidence for a collapse of human population in the wake of the Younger Dryas boundary, both of which may be indications of ecosystem disruption on Santa Rosa. Evidence for periodic fires during the late glacial maximum is evident in sedimentary records from San Miguel Island, which is one of those, that island group, and charcoal records from Soledad Pond and Abalone Rocks Marsh, both on Santa Rosa Island, indicate that grass brush fires were part of the island ecology throughout the Holocene. Okay. But here we present evidence for intense biomass burning of conifers and subsequent mass wasting of the landscape in Arlington Canyon. This expands and complements preliminary evidence for approximately 13,000 year ago wildfires discovered on San Miguel. So they say that the fires, and this would be normal, that the fires are going to be followed by mass wasting events, because a really intense fire is going to denude the hills of vegetation. So once the vegetation is gone, what happens to the erosional processes? Right?
Mudslides. California
Mudslides. Yes, exactly. So I'm not going to pull up the stratigraphic section here. I'm just going to talk about it briefly.
Yeah, we only got a few more minutes left too, Randall.
Okay, so in the stratigraphic section, there is a dark layer, right? This is now pretty consistent here. So in talking about, there's actually two dark layers. There's an upper one and a lower one. But the upper dark layer is organic carbon rich and contains charcoal and charred tree branches up to 5 centimeters in diameter. Intense wildfire evidence is also indicated by the presence of carbon spherules in the lowest dark layer. These spherules occur widely in the Younger Dryas boundary layer in North America and have also been found in superficial sediments associated with intense coniferous forest crown fires. Elongated carbon forms found in a number of levels in the sequence have similar surface features to the carbon spherules. Both carbon forms have the appearance of melted and charred organic matter and a moderately glossy shell, unlike that of normal charcoal, and interior vesicles that are typically a few micrometers in diameter. The accelerator mass spectrometry carbon-14 dates for the lower black organic carbon-rich layers suggest that they accumulated rapidly between 13,000 and 12,900 years ago. So yeah, biomass burning at the 13 to 12.9 thousand years ago was followed by erosion, because we're talking about a canyon here with hill sloped sides, right? So the biomass burning is followed by erosion with sediments containing charcoal, wood, and detrital carbon. And these sediments came down off the hills and filled the bottom of the canyon floor. This organic carbon-rich dark layer was then rapidly buried and preserved by a series of mass sediment wasting events of a denuded early Younger Dryas landscape. The upper 4 meters of the deposit also date to between 13 and 12.9 thousand years ago, indicating periodic fires and sediment mass wasting of the landscape in close succession in the early Younger Dryas, or rapid redeposition of material from the lowest burn layer in the subsequent mass wasting. So yeah, the onset of the Younger Dryas closely correlates with a major abrupt decline in the evidence of juniper trees, the pollen from juniper trees, suggesting that these trees were abundant regionally before but not after. So we could go on, but there's one of the things in the aftermath of this is that the environment of recovery in the aftermath of this total denudation of the islands was very different from the environment that preceded these events. And of course, we're going to find that to be true on a much larger scale. This suggests that there was rapid ecosystemic change in the wake of major regional wildfires and associated landscape disturbance. These changes are consistent with the record of wildfire from the upper Arlington Canyon and evidence for abrupt change in island vegetation during the Younger Dryas. And so one of the things that would have happened also with this change, any vegetation that didn't get burned off is going to die. And now you're going to have a fuel buildup. And so there are subsequent spikes of these fire proxies like ammonium, and there are others that we'll talk about: formate, oxalate, acetate, others that are all signatures in the ice of these biomass burning events. But then there was subsequent biomass burning events in the Younger Dryas, and this could be attributed to the fact is that whatever vegetation survived the initial onslaughts then died because the climate changed so drastically. When that vegetation died, it created a huge fuel buildup over the landscape, which subsequently then fueled tremendous fires. So it was a cascading series of events. You see, it's not a simple, it's like what we're looking at here. I think the model here is that Earth normally is constantly seeking equilibrium. It's constantly trying to restore equilibrium. And if left alone, it will eventually, things will eventually settle out, right? I think that, I mean, when you look at the erosion of using hydrological terms, streams and rivers, what they're trying to do is they're trying to erode down the high places and build up the low places. And eventually, if that process is not interrupted, what you end up with is what in geomorphological terms is called a peneplain. And it's been estimated that the whole North American continent could perhaps be reduced to a peneplain maybe in as little as 10 to 12 million years, maybe up to 20 million years. But if erosional processes and depositional processes eventually are going to try to seek this balance. So you go from a high energy environment to a low energy environment. And now everything is stasis, right? There apparently have been times in Earth history where it has sort of achieved this relative stasis, right? But now we've got to look at a model where there are external triggers that can upset that balance, upset that move towards stasis, introduce chaos into the system, and then set off a whole chain of feedback process that might take thousands of years literally to play out. And I'm even going to go so far as to suggest that we are still being affected by the reverberations of the Younger Dryas era.
Wow. It's crazy.
Yeah, I do. I think I've heard you say that before too. That there's that the Earth is still seeking
Equilibrium.
from the events of the Younger Dryas. Yeah.
Yeah, it reminds me too of I think I mentioned this before, but there was a study done on the deep Pacific Ocean temperatures, and they're still dropping from the Little Ice Age.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Which is really crazy.
So then we'll pick this up in the next episode 28. We'll pick this up. We'll look at some of this evidence for the great firestorms. We're going to learn about that. Then we'll go back, and I think it would be interesting to bring in some of the traditional accounts. Look at the accounts of ekperousis and compare what we now know from the scientific model of these great cataclysmic fires, and then the traditional models. And this is something that this will be a theme. This will be something we do throughout this whole series is looking at what the science says, but then also going back to the heritage and the legacy of the past, because one of the working premises of all of this is that material, those traditions that have come down to us are a lot more valuable and potent than they've been given credit for trying to decipher these events, which surely are going to be part of our future at some time. And given the number of near Earth encounters that we're seeing happen, it may be sooner than people think. So at some point then too, what we'll do is we'll talk about what I think is solutions, because look, if we're going to talk about, we want to have basically preserve the pristine nature of the planet and so on, I'm all for that 100%. We've got to protect the environment. But what we got to understand is that there are forces out there that could obliterate the handiwork of man literally in a matter of minutes or hours or a few days, and render this planet as if the human presence had never even been here for the most part, other than a few isolated, dismal ruins here and there to show, yeah, there was once people here, but they're long gone now. Because people don't understand the degree, the severity, the intensity, the magnitude of these events that have regularly occurred on this planet. And that's part of what we're gonna remedy through this series. Is we're gonna try to enlighten people, if you will, educate people about the scale of some of the events that have unfolded on this planet. And as a corollary to that, when we start getting back out into the field, yes, we're going to go back out and we are going to explore these landscapes of catastrophe, where these great cosmic events have left their impress, have left their imprint in the landscape, where they have been laying for 10 or 12 or 20,000 years, waiting for humans to come along who can read the language, who can read the cipher of catastrophe. And see, I think those are the prophets right there.
Oh yeah. So are you a prophet then? Is that what you're saying?
No, not me. We all are. Look, we all are. All of us who are doing this, who are trying to reach back into the past, we are going to be endowed, I think, with a somewhat deeper insight into what the future portends. Not portends, not pretends. So
yeah, I do think that, through the years of listening to you and learning from you, that it changes the way you see everything around you.
Mm-hmm,
You look at a landscape and like I see landscapes now totally different than I did 5 or 10 years ago because of this. So I think that may be part of what you're talking about. You're being aware,
yes,
right?
Yes.
of the natural world around you, and like you can see these imprints and these signs in the landscape, and you're like, okay, I sort of understand what's happening here.
Here's the analogy I'll use, and I'll make this quick because I know we're right at the end.
Yeah.
Let's say you're literate. You don't know how to read, right? Let's say you were raised in an isolated environment. You have no idea how to read. You're completely illiterate. Now you're going through modern society, and everywhere you look, there are words and phrases and names and sentences, and you can't read any of it. It's just forms and images, but conveys no meaning at all, right? Now somebody takes you back into your enclave of isolation, and they begin to instruct you. They teach you, here's the alphabet. You put these together, and here's words. You put these words together, and there's sentences. And now you can convey meaning with those sentences. So that person, that illiterate person, spends a year in this isolated chamber, imbibing this knowledge, and now can read. You present this person with a book, with a paper, and they can, yes, okay, what was meaningless gibberish to me before, I can read it now. Take this person, they walk out into the world, and they look around, and they see the world through new eyes. Suddenly, there's all of this new information there that they were oblivious to before. It's just like the people that are colorblind that are getting these glasses that allow them to see color for the first time, right? In effect, that's what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to endow people with the eyes to see this message, this story that has been engraved into the planetary landscape and now awaits complete decipherment. So that's our job, guys.
I'll just eat and drink and get married while you guys do that. Just call me when we have to fight aliens.
In our crystal spaceships.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's awesome.
Eat and drink. Yeah. Eating and drinking and giving in marriage. There you go.
As it was in the days of Noah, when the people were eating and marrying.
Yeah.
Eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that the flood came and swept them all away. Now,
right, well, we'll warn you, I guess. Is that what you're asking?
See, it's not saying that that's not good stuff. It's just basically saying that's not enough. You can't, like the Hopi said, well, the disaster befell people when they weren't paying attention to the plan of the Creator anymore.
Right.
They weren't paying attention to the bigger picture. You know, Lao Tzu said, there will be disaster when men lose the sense of awe. Kind of the same idea. People need to get back out into the world, into the nature, under the night sky, and be overcome by awe. It's not happening enough. But again, that's
especially
part
now.
of what we're here to do.
Yep. So we have the Scablands Trip. We're planning that for September, and it's still planned for September, and nothing has changed. So anybody interested in that should go to what is it? contactatthecabin.com/Carlson.
Yes.
But the links are in the show notes, right?
Correct.
Everybody can email the show at cosmographia1618@gmail.com. I think Brad and I mostly look at the emails, but Randall does look at them too. And I also want to say thanks for everybody that is on the Patreon. Like the Patreon numbers keep going up, but I want to give a specific shout out to Ian. Just pledged $90 a month on Patreon. So thanks so much to Ian for that. That's
thanks,
really
Ian.
awesome. That just came in while we were doing the show, so that was
beautiful.
Awesome.
Yeah.
We love you, Ian. We don't know you, but hopefully we'll get to know you in the future.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And thanks to everybody else who supports the Patreon. And you can find links for that in the show notes or go to the website, cosmographia.com.
Yeah, I think that once all of this stuff blows over and we can start hanging out again, we should throw a big party, have everybody come.
Yeah.
And we'll just have a wild weekend. We'll relive the 70s.
The Gorge Amphitheater right out there on the Columbia River.
That's
Yeah,
true.
Sounds
Yep.
great.
Well, so we filled up the first week though of the Scablands Trip, right? That's
Right.
a done deal. So what we're looking at now is if we're going to do a second,
Yes.
a sequel.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah, so don't be alarmed if it says sold out.
Right.
Just email Darren.
Right. The information to get a hold of Darren, who's one of the coordinators, is there on the website. So don't worry that it says sold out. If you want to go, let him know, because we're finding out if there's enough people to do a second week.
And I understand
That's right.
they're holding the retreat resort conference center for us on Soap Lake
Yes.
Yes.
for a while anyway. If we can
Yes.
get a
Pull another
get
week
a second
together.
group
Yep,
together.
correct.
That's right.
Yeah,
Brad, you got any updates on the video channel? Anything else?
Well, just briefly, that even though it says Randall Carlson channel, I'm the one that's commenting.
Yeah.
It says Randall Carlson, but I put a little BY at the end. Brad Young, that's me. So Randall's not perusing them and commenting, as far as I know.
not yet,
So I
but
just want people to realize that it says Randall Carlson, but it's me, and I'm putting BY on there so they can know that.
yeah, and the way you can tell the difference between me and Brad is that I'm a lot hairier.
And he signs his
Brad.
with BYOB.
Okay.
The other thing is we're going to have I set one up, but it was a temporary link. So we're going to have the instant donate tip jar there right on the channel banner, like is on the Cosmographia website. So we're going to get that set up. So people that don't want to get into Patreon, just want to do a one-time payment, it's going to be right there on the channel header banner.
All right.
Yep.
Sweet.
And then by the time this comes out, all the episodes should be up there and live, and we'll have a sequential playlist starting from the beginning going to current, and I'm going to set one up backwards, so it's starting from the current and going back to the beginning, so people can keep up either way.
Yeah.
I'm going to try to make it easy as possible, but yeah, the since period of confusion, we're going to be by.
Yeah.
Well, and then the new website.
Right. The new website will help once it's up.
Oh yeah.
And
yeah. So randallcarlson.com coming soon, coming real soon.
Very soon.
And yeah, we'll leave it there, but it's coming real soon.
Yeah.
Yep. All right, guys, it was a great show.
I had a hell of a time.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Likewise.
Destruction by floods and fire. I see the title
Yeah,
already.
that's the two-fisted destruction.
Right. More fire destruction next week, right, Randall? That's what we're
Oh
gonna
yeah,
do?
I mean,
All right.
yeah, we're talking destruction here for now.
Okay.
And then of course that's part of the trinity of being, the destructive process, then the creation process, and then the preservation. So we'll come from each of those different angles. Like, how does the creation? We'll talk about that. And then that's when we'll get back into some exobiology stuff.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Stay
and
tuned,
then preservation, which is what do we do to preserve the world, sustain, and how do we prevent the next global ecological catastrophe?
Great show. Let's wrap
Yeah.
it.
All right.
All right, guys.
Great. Can't
Talk to you
wait.
next week.